Good afternoon, and welcome to this session in the Shape Your Future series, where we are exploring the STEM career journeys of Australia's rising stars. Today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Emily Fleece. I'm Alejandra Fernandez, and I am a PhD researcher in cancer at QUT University, and I am also part of the Catalyst program at the Academy of Technology and Engineering. As we gather from around Australia, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we meet. I'm joining you today from the Turrbal land. I pay respect to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who join us online today. As we share and discuss our own knowledge and practices, we acknowledge the deep knowledge forever embedded in custodianship of country. Before we get into this session, you would have seen that this is being recorded. This and all talks in this series will be available on the STELR YouTube channel for you to revisit anytime. There is also a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you have any questions, drop them in there and we will get to them either during the talk or in the discussion at the end. There is also a chat function, but any questions should be in the Q&A section. Finally, you'll be sent back from a form and a worksheet after the session to the email you registered. And please let us know what went well and what you might like to see in our series next year. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Emily Fleece to tell us how she came to be working in sustainable communities. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that introduction. I'll just share my screen now. Okay, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that all right? Good. Okay. Thanks so much for joining me today, everybody. So I'd like to talk to you about my journey to my current career. I'm a lecturer and research fellow at the University of Tasmania. I co-lead a research theme in the Sustainable Communities and Waste Hub, which is part of the National Environmental Science Program. And I've co-founded several STEM-related not-for-profit organizations. So before I start, I'd like to also do an acknowledgement of country. I'm joining you from the home of the Palawa Pakana people of Lutruwita, Tasmania, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So first of all, you've probably noticed that I don't sound like an Australian. So I'm from the United States, from that little state of New York. And I always tell people I'm from upstate New York to clarify that I'm not from New York City. So downstate New York looks like that picture. Upstate New York looks much more like this. It's beautiful forests and rivers and mountains, lots of farming communities and small towns. And it's a wonderful place to live, to have grown up, and reminds me a lot of Tasmania, my new home. So my first journey into studies was at the University of Buffalo. So this is where I did my Bachelor of Arts. I studied anthropology and psychology. I had a hard time deciding what majors to do because I found a lot of things interesting. And I also didn't want to do things that were, too hard and were going to cut into my social life. So I looked at the classes that were available and I chose the ones that I thought were really fascinating and figured out what majors those could lead to. And anthropology and psychology are both ways of exploring human behavior. So I think people are fascinating creatures and wanted to understand more about why we do the things that we do. And anthropology explores that from a cultural and evolutionary standpoint, and psychology from a psychological and biological standpoint. So that led to a Bachelor of Arts. But when I graduated, I found out that there's no clear career pathway for people with a Bachelor of Arts in psychology and anthropology. I was working at Subway before I graduated with my degree, and I was working at Subway after I graduated. I also spent a couple of years teaching outdoor education. So I would take kids on hikes in the woods and learn about the animals and plants in the forest and streams and ponds of New York. And that was a lot of fun, but didn't pay very well, and there wasn't a career pathway out of that. So, but I enjoyed being outside. So I took a volunteer position on a research project in Bolivia in South America. And this is related to anthropology, the study of primates. So I went to Bolivia and I got to follow around these beautiful Bolivian gray TT monkeys. I'd walk around in the forest and find them, observe them, and record the behaviors that they were doing. And then if I saw them poo, I'd run over and scoop that poo into a little vial so that the researchers of that project could explore the parasites that were in the poo. And the study was about comparing the parasite loads, the health of these monkeys, and along with their behaviors in different types of forests. So in an intact forest that was pretty healthy, and a degraded forest that had been had some logging happen. And that got me thinking about these connections between the health of the environment and the health of the animals living there. And because I was, scooping up poo without gloves on and exposing myself to some of those parasites, also how that then impacts human health. And this field is called disease ecology and epidemiology. And it explores the relationship between human, animal, domestic animal, and wildlife health, and how that's impacted by the surrounding health of the environment and environmental quality. So through that volunteer role, I really got interested in this idea of the shared relationship of our health, and I decided to go back to do further study and take on a PhD in disease ecology. So the problem was that degree was a science degree, and my background was a Bachelor of Arts. So I hadn't done a lot of the maths and the natural science that would support me in doing that sort of degree. But nonetheless, I figured I'd give it a go. So I undertook a PhD in disease ecology in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Michigan State University. And one of the wonderful things about academia is that it's very flexible, so you can choose your hours somewhat. Which means, you can sleep late and work late if that's your preference, but it also means that it might mean that you're working on the weekends. And I found in that PhD process, because I felt like I was behind and I didn't know as much as the other people in the program, and I didn't have that foundation in science, that I had so much to catch up on, and I was working a lot in that program. So what I studied was whether birds are capable of transmitting a tick-borne bacteria and whether they get sick from that infection. So this tick-borne bacteria called Anaplasma phagocytophilum is an emerging infectious disease in the United States, similar to Lyme disease. It's carried by ticks. It infects wildlife, but then it can also infect humans. And that's called a zoonotic infection, the ones that are travel amongst animals mostly, but can also infect humans. And to answer these questions, I did several intensive field studies. So I spent time catching birds and taking blood samples from them, also identifying the birds and banding them and releasing them again. I took some of those birds into captivity and exposed them to ticks. So I had infected ticks that had this bacteria, put the ticks on the birds, and then let them feed on the birds, collected the ticks, so they drop down into these little trays underneath the birds' cages. I'd have to dig through the poo and the feathers in those trays and find these tiny little floating ticks, pick them up, grind them up, test if they had the infection. And that's a way for finding out if the birds are passing on that infection. And I'd also monitor them for signs of their health to determine if they were getting sick. So it was a pretty intensive process. To do the field work, I'd have to get up at 4:30 in the morning to go set up the mist nets to capture the birds when they're most active in the morning. So it's pretty grueling. And around the third year of that PhD, I was working out some of the details of my last third and final field season, and how to write up some of this captive study that I'd had birds in captivity for about 6 months and collected a whole bunch of data on them, and was getting ready to write that up. So I had a meeting with my supervisor. I went into her office and she said, could you close the door? And I was like, oh, sure. Yeah, what's up? And she said something like, I don't think this process is working out for me. I don't think we're compatible as a supervisor and student. And you are not going to be able to finish your PhD with me. And I'd like you to figure out what your other options are. And I was completely blindsided by that. I thought things were going pretty well. We'd had some, disagreements about parts of the process, but I thought that was kind of normal and was respectful and everything. So was really blindsided by that. But she made it clear I wouldn't be able to finish my PhD as I'd planned. So I left the office in a bit of a daze. I sat down on the ground and just started crying and experienced, I felt rejection and failure, that I hadn't been able to do this difficult thing, and confirmation of those insecurities that I wasn't, didn't have the foundation in science. I wasn't good enough for this process, and a loss of identity. So I really, when I started that PhD, was very excited about it. I bought all the gear from the Fisheries and Wildlife Department, the sweatshirt, the sweatpants, the hat, the pint glass, the bumper sticker for my car, bought my parents all the swag as well, really took that on as my identity. And when that rug was pulled out from under me, that I couldn't finish my PhD there, just felt a bit lost about what the rest of my pathway and process was going to look like. But luckily, I had incredible mentors at Michigan State, some folks that were super supportive and really helped me figure out what my options were. I had incredible friends that I met there that also were wonderfully supportive, as was my family. I met my partner there, my, at the time, future husband, now husband of 9 years. And through the support of all those people, I decided that I would finish that degree as a master's. So after 3.5 years into that process, I graduated with a master's degree. And I was going to start the process over somewhere else. But I felt like if I'm going to do this again, and I decided I really did enjoy the research process. I really, I thought I wanted to teach in a university setting. And so I wanted to do that degree. But I figured if I was going to do it again, I'd do it somewhere exciting, like Australia, home of amazing surf and incredible unique animals, rich culture and history, and unfortunately also a terrifying percentage of the world's deadliest creatures. But I could overlook that to move to this wonderful country and do a PhD again. So I moved to South Australia and took on PhD attempt number 2. And in that degree, I stayed with the disease ecology and epidemiology. And this time I studied a mosquito-borne virus, still a zoonotic infection. So Ross River virus infects mostly mammals, mostly macropods, so kangaroos and wallabies, and their inbred cousin wallaroos. Australia has such fascinating creatures in it. But anyway, mostly infects animals, and sometimes an infected mosquito will bite a human, and then we get sick with Ross River virus disease. So I'm always interested in these transmission dynamics, that the way that these infections circle through animals into humans, and how that's impacted by the surrounding environment. So the amount of infections of Ross River virus varies across South Australia, as it does around other countries in Australia too. And I wanted to understand why. What is it about some of those areas that makes them really good at breeding Ross River virus disease? So to answer that question, I did a couple of things. I went around and trapped tens of thousands of mosquitoes. I tested the blood in their stomach to see what animals they were feeding on. And I developed a new special trap that allowed me to test whether they were infected with the virus. I put that little skirt on the mosquito to remind myself that to point out that I was looking for female mosquitoes. So it's female mosquitoes that take blood from animals, and that's to get the protein they need to make their eggs, to lay their eggs. So male mosquitoes don't feed on blood. So I was really focused on the female mosquitoes. And I made these special traps using pantyhose and paper clips and recycled milk cartons. So it was on a really tight budget, but it allowed me to test the spit of the mosquitoes, because that's where the virus occurs. So when a mosquito sucks on blood, it spits into the animal it's drinking blood from to keep the blood from coagulating, so it keeps flowing and it can keep drinking the blood. And it's actually that spit that we're allergic to and gives us an itchy bump. That's why we itch from a mosquito bite, is an allergic reaction to their saliva. But anyway, if they're infected with virus, it comes out in that saliva as well. And that's an important way to differentiate between a mosquito that's capable of giving someone an infection, infectious mosquitoes, and mosquitoes that just have fed on virus and have it in their stomach. Because a lot of times it can be in the stomach, but it never makes it to the saliva where they can infect another individual. So I developed this special way of testing the mosquitoes, which was, fun and creative, and yeah, I enjoyed that process. And I talked about it in my 3-minute thesis, so you can hear more about that trap in my 3-minute thesis if you'd like. And I used that trap to find out where mosquitoes were infected across South Australia. And then I did some statistical models to understand what features of the environment contributed to where the virus was occurring. And one of the things I explored was urbanness and how cities were impacting disease transmission. So that second PhD process was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. It was fun. I loved learning about Ross River virus disease transmission, going around the state to capture mosquitoes and learn about this system. It was also successful. I was awarded Thesis of the Year. I was first place for my university in the 3-minute thesis trials. And I also just had a good life around that, an enjoyable life. I got married, I had my first kid, I had a honeymoon in Brazil, started 2 nonprofit organizations around science communication, taught classes, moved internationally and then interstate, finished writing my thesis from Tasmania, and started 2 new jobs. So one of those new jobs I started near the end of my PhD was with the University of Adelaide and some colleagues there, and was exploring more of the impacts of urbanization on disease transmission and health of people living in cities. So that followed on from my explorations of Ross River virus epidemiology, where there's less virus transmission in cities. So cities are actually protective against Ross River virus for a lot of reasons I don't have time to go into right now. But that was interesting to me because we're becoming a more urban species. We're now over 50% of humans live in cities, and looking forward, that's going to go towards about 70% by the year 2050. So I was curious how that was impacting our health. So in a qualitative review with some colleagues, we looked at which diseases were associated with cities and why. And we found that quite a few diseases have been found to occur at higher rates in cities and are associated with different characteristics of the cities. So things like asthma and allergies, cardiovascular disease, some types of cancer, some types of infection, some mental health disorders occur at higher rates in cities. And so we explored, the papers showing those higher rates, and explored why they were saying that cities were contributing to those disease patterns. And listed here are some of those contributions, like air pollution, light pollution, noise pollution, a transient and migrant and dense population that really impacts disease transmission. We've seen that a lot recently with COVID, decreased exposure to sunlight. And another one that's on this list is altered microbial exposure. So that's looking at so in recent years, we found out that human microbiomes, the bacteria and fungi and protozoas that live in our body, are really important for our health. The composition of those communities of bacteria especially are important for our health. And cities can be altering that composition by changing the microbes we're exposed to in the environment. So the general idea is that exposure to a diversity of bacteria, especially in childhood, can contribute to how our immune system develops and our overall health later in life. And so the fact that these microbiomes are important is really reflected in the number of them that are in and on our bodies. So we have our human cells, there are estimates between, that there's about the same number of bacteria as there are human cells, or that they outnumber human cells 1 to 2. I think the new estimates are about 1-to-1 ratio, but anyway, there's a lot of them. And if you count the number of genes, our human genes are outnumbered about 1 to 200 by bacterial genes. So that's just underlining this rising awareness of how important the microbial communities of our body are for our health. So it was around that time I was exploring urban-associated diseases and zoonotic disease transmission that I moved to Tasmania. So my partner studies Tasmanian devil facial tumor, and there's kind of one place in the world that's good to do. So we came to Tasmania for his work, and I was able to come down and finish writing my thesis from here. I came down with with one boy at that point. We had a 4-month-old we moved down here with, and I had a second child here in Tassie. And, one of the wonderful things about Tasmania, it's a very safe environment. There's not much infectious disease. There's not really much mosquito-borne disease. We do have some Ross River virus, but really not much. There's not many tick-borne bacteria. So my skills in disease ecology aren't super sought after in Tassie. So I had to figure out, another direction. And as I was doing that work with the urban-associated diseases and finding the importance of exposure to microbial communities, I decided to explore that a little more and look at the benefits of nature, of how nature can be supportive of health rather than how it can expose us to these infectious diseases. So it was around this time that I was raising these kids and seeing them eat dirt. So this is I looked this up a lot. It's very normal for children to do this. I'm not a terrible parent for letting them shove dirt in their face, but it was shocking to me how much they did it and how much they enjoyed it. I mean, look at how happy they are just eating dirt. And so I was interested in that exposure to microbial communities and how that impacts our health, and how that is influenced by the surrounding environment. So that's what I started studying at that time in my postdoctoral work. So I've done some research now on that microbial exposure, and this is one way that some colleagues and I were thinking about it. So urban exposure to urban green spaces has been shown to be beneficial in many different ways. So this figure is showing some of those ways, like green spaces in cities can reduce air temperature, they can clean the air for us, they have other ecosystem services, they provide opportunities for us to socialize and have physical activity, they're calming environments. And we highlighted this pathway where urban green spaces also provide support biodiversity, that supports a biodiverse environmental microbiome, which can support a biodiverse human microbiome, which is good for our immune system and health. So just highlighting that possible pathway, connecting urban green spaces to health and well-being. And I'm also doing some research on that here in Tassie. So myself and my colleague Penny Jones went around and sampled soil at a bunch of different environments. And on the right here, this is Jess Grierson, an honors student that my friend Penny and I supervised, who has done an outstanding job analyzing the very complex microbiome data that we got, but comparing how the diversity of microbial communities varies across different parts of the city. In this case, backyards, and then parks with a high intensity of use and parks that have a low intensity of use, and looking at the diversity of bacteria under that assumption that exposure to biodiverse microbial communities can be good for our health. And so we are finding some interesting differences within the city of how the diversity of microbes varies. And just to add a layer of complexity, this is what those patterns look like for bacteria. We also looked at fungi and protozoa, which are different components of the microbial community, and the patterns are different across those different types of communities. So this is a really interesting area of study, is the environmental microbiome, and how features of the environment are impacting that microbiome. So I was doing this research about the benefits of nature and green space and biodiversity, and then feeling like, okay, this is research. What are we going to do about it? How do we translate this research to have real world impacts? So I've found ways to do that. One of the ways is through teaching. So I teach a unit called Backyard Biodiversity that helps people learn about the diversity of animals in their backyard, think about why biodiversity matters within a sustainable development goals framework, and learn how to make their backyard more biodiverse by changing the habitat that's available there. And so I love teaching this class. It's fun, it's exciting, and the students are awesome. And I also am doing some research around it, trying to understand, is this having an impact on the community? And through that research, so I do that by providing a survey for students before and after the unit and looking at how their responses change throughout that class. But it does look like it's having an impact on people. So these are some quotes that are showing how it's changed the way people look at the world, what they're paying attention to, and how they're passing that on to their kids or inspiring others in their community to make changes to their garden. How they're actually making those changes. So 97.5% of the students said that they were likely or extremely likely to modify their backyard in the way that they planned through the class to enhance the biodiversity there. Student knowledge increased, so they self-described number of species that they knew of plants increased by 7 from before to after the class, and for animals increased by 11. But then there was also these, broader impacts. So in designing the unit, I put in things like, activities that would get them walking around their neighborhood, talking to their neighbors, being active out in their garden, observing the wildlife. Survey, I wanted to test whether the unit was having those impacts that I was hoping for. And some of those do look like they're occurring. So the students, on average, increased the number of neighbors' names that they knew by 1. Students, on average, were more active outdoors in good weather and in bad weather from before to after the class. They had an increase in how much they seem to value indigenous practices and knowledge for conserving Australia's biodiversity. And they were more likely to be engaged in behaviors that were supporting the environment, so conservation or sustainability focused behaviors. So teaching is one way that I found that we can actually contribute to a more sustainable and better society. Another way just recently is with a group of colleagues, we've been awarded a grant through the environmental science program. So the National Environmental Science Program is $149 million over 7 years to 4 different hubs. And the idea for this program is that it supports the research that can inform environmental decision-making for our country. So I'm part of the Sustainable Communities and Waste Hub, which is one of the 4 hubs. Our hub has 5 impact priority areas or research themes that it focuses on. The first one's called Sustainable People Environment Interactions. And I co-lead that theme with a colleague at Monash. And the project within that I'm responsible for is about nature connection. And we are researching how people connect with nature, how that varies across the country and how we can support it. The role of urban greening in nature connection and in climate adaptation and resilience, what nature-based solutions are and what they look like in Australia and how we can use those to support greater connection and resilience. We're doing some wonderful Aboriginal engagement in Tasmania with this project and elsewhere with the other project. And thinking about how sustainability education can contribute to nature connection as well. And the idea for this project is that it can inform and contribute to national level policies. So Australia's strategy for nature is really reliant on nature connection, and that's one of the primary goals of that program. And the National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy is something that our research will be able to inform as well, along with our international reporting obligations. So Australia has to report internationally about how we're doing on our Ramsar wetlands or our IUCN, our threatened species conservation and those sorts of reports. So the research that we're doing in this program can inform our reporting and policy making at the federal level. So that's some of the, thinking big with some of the research that I'm doing, but also wanting to feel like I've got a local impact. So I mentioned before that I started two not-for-profit organizations, and those are called Science in the Pub. So while I was doing my PhD in Adelaide, I started, myself and my partner, started Science in the Pub Adelaide. And then when we moved to Tasmania, we handed that one over to some friends and colleagues in Adelaide, and that's still running 8 years later. And we started Science in the Pub Tasmania. The idea for both of these was that was to form community around critical thinking and around science. We felt like if people were more in touch with the science that was happening, both, especially in their community, that they would be better prepared to make informed decisions in voting, for example. And if they felt personally connected, like they knew the scientist that was doing the research, they're more likely to trust that science that's being created. So we felt we could contribute that way, and they've been really enjoyable, ongoing programs. Another program that I started 3 years ago now is the Inspiring Women in STEM Fellowship Program here in Tassie. And this, started from getting an award for outstanding science engagement and outreach. And there was a little small amount of money that came along with that award. And I wanted to put it towards supporting other incredible women in science. So during my PhD and postdoctoral work here at UTAS, have met some just outstanding women who've overcome incredible hurdles and are just resilient and fill me with such hope that I wanted to do something to be able to support those women. So I created this program that I fundraise for and then administer, that's able to give small amounts of money, about $1,500 to $2,000 to a current PhD student studying in STEM. And that those funds go towards them engaging with their local community, whatever their community is. So this year, these are our fellows for this year, the third year of the program. Kumudu and Dilani are both from Sri Lanka and engaged with communities there. Sadamani is from India and engaged with a community there. And Shasta Henry is from Tassie, and she's been engaging with regional communities around Tasmania. And so I am able to provide some funds for them to do that, and some science communication coaching for them as well about how to tell their STEM story. And then I can connect them with opportunities to do that and to be mentors for their community. So that's been a really wonderful piece of work that I've been able to do to have that impact. So reflecting on my career pathway thus far, anyway, as a scientist, researcher, teacher, and someone impacting national policy and local community, I look back at that journey and think about, what advice would I give to my former self or other students making decisions about what career to take. So the first one is to not be afraid of failure, to take on the challenges. Like when I was deciding what majors to do in my bachelor's degree, I know I made decisions that were a little bit easier. I chose not to do certain majors or take certain courses because I thought they'd be hard. I wasn't sure if, I'd do well in them. And I wish I hadn't worried so much about failure, because that's our best opportunity for growth and for learning is when we fail, which, when I wasn't able to finish that first PhD attempt, it wasn't very pleasant for me. I didn't enjoy that experience, but I know that it really created a good opportunity for me to grow and for me to think more deeply about what I wanted from life and what pathway I was on. So I'd say don't be afraid of failure, shoot for the stars. And then the next one is it's okay to not know your career path. I remember feeling guilty when I was younger. My parents, my dad especially, would always ask me what my plan was. What was I going to do with my life? What kind of career did I want? And I never knew. I didn't have a good answer for that. He's stopped asking me that, thankfully, which is good because I still don't know the answer. I don't know if I'm going to stay in academia, if I'm going to, or if I'll, go work in government or in industry or start a consulting business or what. I don't know, but I've gotten to the point where I can trust that I can ride out the bumps and the uncertainties and to trust myself to be able to pivot and overcome the challenges that life will eventually throw at me. So knowing the path it feels less important now. And that's advice that I would pass on, that you don't have to know. So what I recommend, and this, I acknowledge this is a very privileged thing to say, but to follow your passions. Not everyone can do that. That's not always available to people. But if you can follow your passions, I think it is likely to lead to success, because if you really care about something, you're more likely to work hard at it. You're more likely to succeed at it because, you're really going to put in that effort. So following the passions, it's not just self-indulgent. I think it is more likely to lead to success. And then finally, create change and impact wherever and however you can. So, I think we all, well, most of us anyway, want to do things to make the world a better place. I have felt like having a more informed and connected society might contribute to that, to better decision making. And so that's why I started the 2 science communication non-for-profits. And then I met these incredible, inspiring women who've overcome amazing challenges and been shown such resilience to study a PhD in STEM. And I found a way that I could support them using my skill set. So that's what I can recommend is thinking about what is your unique mix of skills and what are you passionate about doing, and use those to make change and to create impacts. And there sometimes feel like little things. I feel like, the Science in the Pub and the Inspiring Women in STEM Fellowship, they're little things, but they have flow-on effects and can lead to big change. So that's my career journey, and the recommendations and advice I can pass back to my former self or other people who are trying to choose a career. And I'd be happy for anyone to follow up with me and ask any questions they have. Anytime. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much for that incredible talk. I really enjoyed it a lot, and I'm pretty sure that everyone else did as well. We're going to move to the Q&A session, and I think we have a question from the audience. And it says, "Hi, Emily. Do you bring in Indigenous knowledge into your biodiversity course?"
Yeah, good question. So we do. We have some sections in there that are reflecting on what's known from an Indigenous perspective on different components of the unit, what sort of approach they take, or some examples of approaches that they take to biodiversity, to supporting biodiversity, for example, through their fire management regime, and introducing different concepts, stories of how animals were created. So a Dreamtime story is included in one section, and some perspectives on what are species and how they think about categorizing different forms of life. So we do try to integrate some of that Indigenous knowledge, and I think there's, with that unit and with so much of what we do, there's a lot of opportunity to do that better. But yeah, we do try to reflect some of that cultural knowledge.
Thank you. I actually have some questions myself. I was just writing them down as you were speaking. So you mentioned that so depending on the city, there are different like environmental facts that would make certain diseases be like at a higher rate than others. Have you like compared these to, let's say, I don't know, differences between first world countries and like developing countries and or like third world countries, and how like probably the exposure to like these different environment features may have an impact, like for example, on voluntarily playing with mud?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. The simple response is I have not been able to quantify that yet.
Mhm.
So I have another analysis planned, which is a very, a big project that I'm hoping that I've started, and I'm hoping I can get the time to finish that one. That would do a bit more quantitative analysis in that respect. But what I can say is generally, yeah, there are huge differences. So cities are complex and variable. So they change. They're very different according to location, right? A city in one country is very different than a city in another country. They have important variation within the city. So, for example, rich areas of the city experience different health challenges than poor areas of a city. So there's variation within cities, across cities, and through time. So these patterns change through time. So it is a complex question. The general pattern is that there's more infectious disease in developing countries and developing cities, especially ones that don't have great infrastructure for sanitation. That facilitates transmission of infectious diseases. Yeah, so it's a good question, and it's something I'd very much like to unpick with some really complex statistical approaches that require quite a bit of data going into them. But I do have plans to do that, so I'd love to answer that more fully.
That's really cool. I'll be looking forward to your research in the future. Also, so you've said that you were working during your PhD on understanding how ROS virus is transmitted from mosquitoes to humans, right? Does this study help you understand any sort of transmission between mosquitoes, like for example, dengue or chikungunya? Like, are they similar in the way that they transmit the viruses?
Yeah, so each virus has a different transmission ecology. So like dengue doesn't use animals. It just is mosquito, person, mosquito, person. So it did help me understand the transmission ecology. That ecology is different for Ross River virus in different places. So it uses different hosts. That's what we call the animals that are infecting mosquitoes. And it uses different mosquitoes in different places. So I was able to inform about that in South Australia. I was also able to explore the environmental factors. So my final synthesis chapter from my PhD took I looked across different spatial scales to understand the risk factors. And I looked at different components of the environment. So I found things like the biodiversity of mammals and the biodiversity of birds in an area are both important to determining how much Ross River virus there is. Obviously, the mosquito species in an area are important to determining that risk of human infection, but also human behavior is important to determine the risk of human infection. So we see a lot of Ross River virus along the Murray River. And I said in my study, cities were sort of suppressive of Ross River virus risk. There was lower risk of people getting infected in cities. And that's partially because in cities in summer, when it's Ross River virus season, people tend to be inside, in their air conditioned rooms, especially in Adelaide, because it's ridiculously hot in the summer. And and away from mosquitoes. But we found the socioeconomic level of an area was important. So poorer areas tended to have more infection. And even in the summer, if you're indoors in a poorer area, it's less likely to have, be closed off and have air conditioning, more likely to have windows open, maybe rips on screens, those sorts of things, so that people might be more likely to be exposed to mosquitoes. And also in the Riverlands, the Murray River area, when people visited there or lived there, they were more likely to be outdoors recreating. So swimming and fishing and hiking and, playing in the river. So that exposed them to mosquitoes that could be infected with Ross River virus. So that it helped us understand both the transmission dynamics, which animals might be hosts in South Australia and which mosquitoes are carrying it, and also why people are getting infected where they are.
Oh, that's really cool. Now I just want to ask some more personal questions that I don't know about your life during your PhD, because you did mention that you spent some time in Bolivia and that you were, catching birds to undertake your studies. Did you develop this really cool ability of seeing a bird and identifying which species is it as soon as you see it?
So I did the study with the primates in Bolivia was before what turned into my master's, before my PhD attempt number one, sorry. I did that study before going back to school. And, through that I got, with practice, you get better at everything, right? So through that, I got better at finding those monkeys up in the trees. They're actually not super easy to find and to track. So I had to stay with them and follow them through the forest with binoculars, finding them and then tracking them. So through that, I got better at spotting those animals and following them. Through the master's, I definitely learned a lot about birds and identifying their age, their sex, their species, because I was running a banding station. So I went from very little expertise with birds to pretty decent expertise with birds. There's a lot of birders out there who would, I should only say decent, not even pretty decent, because on the scale of birders, there's extreme expertise. People are really passionate about it.
Yeah.
And I was good enough to do what I was doing, but not the world expert. So learned heaps during that time and got much better at knowing the birds. Unfortunately, it was the birds in Michigan in the US, and then I lived in Adelaide, and now I live in Tassie, and I have to relearn all the birds here. But of course, it's a fun pursuit.
Yeah, such a nice hobby to have. And for the science in the pub, so you said that you mainly do it to like raise awareness to people about sustainability and science. But you mentioned that you have some programs going. Does that involve any sort of hands-on activities, like, I don't know, brewing your own beer or something like that?
Yeah, so we started Science in the Pub in Adelaide 8 years ago, and then started it here in Tassie again 7 years ago. And like I said, the idea, so my partner and I were seeing, reading the news in the US and seeing a bit of a rise in skepticism for science ideas, and that can lead to some problematic outcomes, and feeling like we could impact that potentially in our little local area through Science in the Pub. So the idea is to break down the ivory tower of science, and help people see that scientists who are studying vaccines or who are studying the environment or disease transmission or new, treatments for cancer, they're not, mad scientists in a lab coat. They're just the people down the street from you that you bump into at the dog park and, at the grocery store. So it was connecting people with the scientists in their area to raise trust. So there's science about science communication. There's research about how to do that. And one of the areas that leads to skepticism is a lack of trust. So we wanted to connect people with their local scientists on a personal level, in an unprofessional setting in the pub. Everybody gets the panelists who present all get a beer beforehand and, tell people what they like to do on the weekends and stuff. So it was to help make people make a personal connection with scientists, but also, of course, to learn about the recent science and get to ask an expert the questions that they have. If you're curious about, how is a vaccine made? Is it safe? What are the risks? How do you test it? Those sorts of things they could ask an expert. So it was to do those, we designed it to address those issues. And then it's morphed, since then. So I said, it's been going for a long time now. And in the last couple of years, I have done a couple additional events. So I've done Science in the Park. So Science in the Pub obviously is aimed at adults, and it's in a pub. They're talks. So we do 3 TED Talk style presentations from scientists, actually mostly scientists, but also practitioners. So we try to represent in our 3 to 4 person panel, both sort of research knowledge, but also experiential knowledge, and value those different forms of knowing. And we always have gender diverse panels as well. Those are just important criteria for us in deciding who's going to present. And yeah, so I have done some hands-on ones. So I've run 2 Science in the Parks now, which are focused on families and kids and hands-on activities in the outdoors. So both connecting kids with science, connecting communities with each other, and connecting people with their local environment. Because, I do this research now on how good it is for us to engage with nature. So I've done 2 of those, and a Science in the Dark, which is the same sort of thing, except it was at nighttime and doing spotlighting and nighttime walks and looking at the stars and all of that. Yeah, so the traditional Science in the Pub events, which are monthly events, are more focused on adults in our presentations, but then we've done a couple of these more hands-on and family-focused events as well through those organizations.
Yeah, well, I think that that's a really fantastic initiative, especially because, like, even if someone spends a lot of time watching movies, the scientists are always often the bad guys.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's great.
That's right. We're not all bad guys. We're not all guys, actually. So.
Yeah. And I have a very final last question. So I just find it fascinating that you decided to do your career based on anthropology, psychology, and art. And I just wanted to ask if have you been able to link the 3 in a way? Like how have you done that? Like, or have you like used science with your art combined into something?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me start it this way. So a couple of years ago, through Science in the Pub for National Science Week, I hosted this big panel event. Yeah, we had like 100 people come to the pub, and it was this really fun sort of debate. And the title of the debate was The Future of Humanity. And I had like a real diverse panel, a marine biologist, a politician, a physicist, an epidemiologist, and these people from really diverse backgrounds, and wanted to ask them about, what trajectory are we on for humanity? Are we headed in a good way? How could we save humanity? And the unanimous answer basically across all of them was that we have the science we need. We need to better understand people. So we need to better, we need to do our social science better, essentially, or we need to focus on that, which was surprising because that's not what you hear in science classes usually.
I don't know.
So that was really interesting to me. And I started in this Bachelor of Arts, which is anthropology, psychology, people call those social sciences. I actually felt, I remember feeling people look down on those fields and seem to think that they were easier or lesser than the natural sciences, or people call them sometimes the hard sciences. thinking they were lesser. And so that's part of the reason that I, internalized that a little bit and thought, all right, well, I'll try these, these other sciences that are supposed to give us a clear answer, right? And so I did this disease ecology and epidemiology, and I learned statistical modeling and coding and could use the word aliquot comfortably in a sentence, and did lab work and did field work and all these different ways. And sometimes you get a clear answer, and a lot of times you don't. There's still a lot of subjectivity, and there's still a lot of interpretation around those natural sciences. So, I sort of went to the hard sciences, the natural sciences, and I'm now coming back. So I've just started doing some survey work with my unit. I've done some surveys with the events that I've hosted, asking people their views and wanting to understand that side of it more. So I've come full circle back to the social sciences, and as a way to understand human behavior, because if we want to make any changes in the world, if we want to be more sustainable in the future, if we want to survive as a species, we need to understand humans better. So yeah, I've sort of come back to that, and I'm now straddling both a little bit. So trying to integrate some of those quantitative methods, the statistics and questions about the environment, collecting data and microbiomes and whatnot, and integrating that with a better understanding of people and through the National Environmental Science Program, thinking about how does that relate to our national policies and the decisions that we make, and how we manage our environment.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's so great. I've enjoyed your talk so much. Thank you so much. I don't believe we have any more questions from the audience. So I just wanted to say thank you for joining us and for sharing your journey with us. And thank you also for tuning in. This series of talks was supported by the Victorian Challenge and Enrichment Series. Don't forget to fill out our feedback form after you leave this session. And the Shape Your Future series will be continuing all this year, so you can tune in to hear from many more scientists. All the information is on the STELR and ATSI website. So thank you so much.
Thanks again.